And so from there, you got apparently right got questions answered, and that kind of. So what did that do for you? I guess is what we want to say.
Mm-hmm.
Well, to tell the truth, I was so impressed that I left. I stayed a month the first time I was there. I was there twice. The first time I stayed only a month, and the reason was it was so impressive that I was afraid I might make a decision based on the emotional attraction of that place.
Mm.
And Christianity had let me down already once. So I wanted to be very, very sure that I was intellectually convinced. And I needed to get away from the internal pressure of needing to make a decision. So I went back home, back to the States. And but because I discovered there was such a thing as apologetics, I kept reading Schaeffer and Lewis and Chesterton, and eventually, strictly on my own, decided I was convinced enough that it was true. But I was not part of a church or anything.
Right.
So I said, well, where do I find other Christians? Well, I knew some back at L'Abri. It was a year and a half later I went back. And that's when I stayed 4 months. And that's where I really got grounded in understanding Christian worldview. And as you know, from reading my books, it has informed all of my thinking and my writing ever since.
Yeah. When you say that Francis Schaeffer, he had a very art sense to him. I remember that was the most impressive thing when reading The God Who Is There, and his dealings with like Picasso and the arts, and how Christianity shouldn't view this art as this kind of other Hollywood perspective or out there perspective, that it falls under the worldview of Christ as well, and it should grab hold of it, and how people like Picasso, his most beautiful painting of his wife wasn't this abstract cubism. It was, something that actually adhered to the form that he saw her in. And that was just one of the things that struck me most, was here's someone who's talking about kind of presuppositionalism for more things than just the sciences and philosophy that kind of we're used to. It makes me smile when someone like Jeff Durbin from Apologia Studios talks about Christian art doesn't have to suck. That Francis Schaeffer is fond of saying, that art belongs to God as well.
Right. In fact, my follow-up to that was writing my book, Saving Leonardo, which is about the arts.
Yeah.
And although I was, there are a lot of books out there now on why Christians should be involved in the arts, so that I didn't spend as much time on that. I spent more time on how can we analyze worldviews when they come to us in artistic forms, when the worldview is expressed not in words, where they're easier to recognize, but when they come to us through the plot line of a story, or the characterization, or they come in a painting through the form of the painting, through the composition. So I was looking more at teaching Christians how to recognize worldviews when they come through these cultural forms. In fact, I just taught this. We're just finishing up in my graduate class right now. We just went through Saving Leonardo. And most people don't realize anymore that the term cultural apologetics was actually coined to describe what Schaeffer did, because that was so unusual. Like you said a minute ago, most people think of apologetics as just abstract arguments.
Yeah.
And he was the first person to really show that worldviews percolate down through a culture, through art and literature and music and so on. And so we need to be worldview savvy in the arts as well.
Yeah. Reading some of his other ones, like his manifesto book, it's sad kind of reading it in the future from his present, where he pretty much called, kind of the what you talk about in Finding Truth, this postmodernist ideals. And at the time of his writing, he still kind of had hope that the world would reject kind of this postmodernist philosophy of what's true for me is not true for you, and vice versa, and that's fine, and we can all live hunky-dory. And it's interesting how correct he was, and especially his writings on abortion. He really kind of was a man from the future. So it's no wonder that he had this great big impact on people.
Yeah, he was prophetic.
Yeah.
He was prophetic. And as you know, the thing I found most useful was his concept of truth. that the modern age has a divided concept of truth, and we cannot communicate effectively that Christianity is true if postmodern people have a different concept of truth. They're not even hearing it.
Right. We're talking past each other, as it were.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it was his first book, Escape from Reason. He starts out saying the main reason we're not effective in communicating the gospel is we don't recognize that the concept of truth has changed, and that things like morality and theology have been put in his. Remember, he had the metaphor of two stories in a building.
Right.
Yeah.
The lowest story is science and reason, and that's objectively true. But the upper story is where the modern person puts anything you can't stick in a test tube and study under a microscope.
The mind, consciousness, the arts. Yeah.
Yes, and spirituality and morality and so on is in the upper story. And this, he said, that's why he said we have to practice pre-evangelism. We often have to help people recognize what we even mean by truth before we can tell them that Christianity is true. And I appreciate that so much, because that was my story when I went to L'Abri. I was such a relativist and such a skeptic that I had to go through that two-step process myself. And that was 1971. It's very close today.
Yeah.
So we had a lot of discussions and arguments about whether there was even such a thing as objective truth before we could get to the question of whether Christianity was that truth.